Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
You know, you'd be prettier if you lost a few pounds. Aunt Linda's voice slithers through the air, coated in that sickly sweet tone she's perfected over decades, the one she uses to disguise cruelty as concern. She doesn't look at me directly when she says it, just swirls the wine in her oversized glass, gazing down at me from her place at the head of the table like a queen addressing a lesser subject. For years, I've let these comments roll off my back, forcing a tight smile, swallowing my anger like the dry, overcooked turkey we choke down every Thanksgiving, pretending everything is fine. But not this year. This year, I meet her gaze head-on, let the silence stretch for just a moment, just long enough for her to assume I'll do what I always do, take it, absorb it, let her win. Instead, I lift my own glass to my lips, take a slow sip of my wine, and smile. That's funny, I say, my voice light, almost conversational, because your husband doesn't seem to mind. The words land like a grenade in the middle of the table. Aunt Linda chokes on her wine so hard that for a brief, thrilling second, I think she might actually need the Heimlich maneuver. Her perfectly manicured hand flies to her chest, her eyes wide, her breath sputtering as the red liquid dribbles from the corner of her mouth onto the ivory tablecloth. The rest of the family freezes, the collective intake of breath so sharp it's almost audible, like they're witnessing something unspeakable, something forbidden. Because that's the thing about my family, we live for passive aggression, for thinly veiled insults disguised as polite conversation. Direct confrontation? That's practically an act of war. Uncle Richard, her husband, doesn't react right away. He just watches her cough, his lips twitching like he's holding back a smirk. His dark eyes flick to me, something unreadable there, something amused. My cousin Melissa, Aunt Linda's golden child, lets her fork clatter against her plate, her mouth hanging open slightly, as if she can't quite believe what she just heard. My mother, seated beside me, presses a warning hand against my arm, her nails digging in slightly. "Jessica," she murmurs, but I don't turn to her. I keep my eyes on Linda, whose face is rapidly turning an alarming shade of pink. The thing about Linda is, she's always been the queen of control. Every Thanksgiving, every holiday, every family gathering, she orchestrates everything, the seating arrangements, the menu, the conversations, the subtle but precise dismantling of my self-esteem. And every year, I've let her do it, let her pick me apart piece by piece while everyone else chuckled awkwardly and looked away, too spineless to call her out. But not this time. Linda finally recovers, dabbing at the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin, her fingers trembling slightly. "Excuse me?" she says, her voice hoarse, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. I tilt my head, feigning innocence. "Oh, did you not hear me?" I say, my tone syrupy sweet, an exact mimicry of hers. "I just said Richard doesn't seem to mind a little extra cushion." The room is deathly silent. Even my father, who usually stays out of the family theatrics, shifts uncomfortably in his seat. Linda's eyes flick to Richard now, and I see it, the flicker of something beneath her composed exterior. Not just embarrassment. Not just anger. Panic. And that's when it hits me. I didn't just land a low blow. I hit something real. Richard doesn't look away. He takes a slow sip of his bourbon, his expression unreadable, his silence stretching a little too long. If this were any other family, he'd have jumped to his wife's defense, brushed off my comment, turned it into a joke. But he doesn't. And that tells me everything I need to know. Linda forces a laugh, brittle and sharp. "Well," she says, voice tight, "I suppose some people have different standards." It's weak. It's the weakest response she's ever given. I feel something bloom in my chest, something warm and unfamiliar. Power. Melissa clears her throat, her eyes darting between her mother and father. "So, she says, trying to redirect the conversation, "how's work, Jess?" Nice try, but the damage is done. Linda is rattled, her mind clearly racing, calculating, reassessing. For the first time in my life, She's the one scrambling for control. And it's delicious. Dessert is served, but the tension at the table is thick enough to choke on. My mother gives me occasional looks, the ones that say enough, don't push it, but I ignore them. Because for once, for the first time in years, I don't feel small. I don't feel like the family punching bag. I feel like I won. But as I catch Richard watching me again, that almost smile still playing on his lips, I realize something. Linda isn't just embarrassed. She's terrified. And whatever secret I just cracked open, it's much, much bigger than I ever expected. The dining room hums with the forced warmth of family chatter, but beneath the clinking silverware and the overly polite laughter, an uncomfortable tension lingers, thick and sticky like the cranberry sauce congealing on the table. Aunt Linda hasn't looked at me since she recovered from choking on her wine, but I see her stiff posture, the way she grips the stem of her glass like she's trying to crush it between her fingers. She's rattled, though she won't admit it, not in front of everyone, not when her entire existence revolves around being perfectly composed. I lean back in my chair, letting the satisfaction of my little victory settle in, but before I can fully enjoy the moment, I catch movement out of the corner of my eye. Uncle Richard, still nursing his bourbon, watching me with an expression that I can't quite place, something between amusement and curiosity, like a man who just stumbled upon an inside joke he wasn't supposed to hear. He isn't laughing, but there's something knowing in his gaze, something almost entertained. After a few more minutes of watching Linda pretend to be engaged in some meaningless conversation about real estate with my mother, Richard finally pushes back his chair and, with a stretch, stands. He doesn't make an announcement, doesn't excuse himself, just casually nods in my direction before walking toward the hallway leading to my grandparents' old study. I hesitate for a moment, wondering if I imagined the invitation, but then I see it, the slight smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, the subtle raise of his brow. He's waiting. I glance at my mother, who is too busy pretending not to notice the obvious tension between Linda and Richard, and then at my cousin Melissa, who has been unusually quiet since my comment at dinner. She's staring down at her plate, her fork absently pushing a piece of pumpkin pie around in slow, deliberate circles. When she senses me looking, she lifts her eyes just enough to meet mine, and for a brief moment, I see something there, something wary, something that looks an awful lot like concern. "Jessica," she murmurs, just loud enough for me to hear but not loud enough to draw attention, "I think you should just drop it." Her voice is careful, measured, but there's something about the way her fingers tighten around the napkin in her lap that tells me she's holding back more than she's saying. The weight of her warning presses against my chest for a moment, a whisper of hesitation, but curiosity wins. I push my chair back and follow Richard down the hall. The study hasn't changed in years, same dark wood shelves lined with books no one actually reads, same heavy leather chairs that smell faintly of cigars and old paper. Richard is already inside, leaning against the massive oak desk that once belonged to my grandfather, swirling the last of his bourbon in his glass as he watches me step inside. He doesn't say anything right away, just tilts his head slightly, examining me the way one might examine an opponent across a poker table. "You know," he finally says, his voice carrying that easy, almost careless charm that I suspect has gotten him out of trouble more times than not, "I always thought you were smarter than you let on." I fold my arms across my chest, leaning against the doorframe, determined not to let him see that his words send a small ripple of unease through me. "Is that a compliment or an insult?" I ask, keeping my tone light, but he just chuckles softly and takes another sip of his drink. "Neither," he says, setting his glass down on the desk with a deliberate click. "Just an observation." I wait, watching him, waiting for him to get to the point, because men like Richard don't call people away from the dinner table just to make small talk. Finally, he exhales, shaking his head slightly, as if he's debating whether or not to say what he really wants to say. Then, with a slow smirk, he leans in just enough for his voice to drop to something almost conspiratorial. "So, Jess," he says, his tone smooth, too smooth, "what else did Linda tell you about me?" The question hangs in the air between us, thick with implications I don't fully understand yet. My stomach twists slightly, the first real flicker of unease settling in, because he isn't just making conversation, he's fishing. For what, I don't know, but I do know one thing. I hit a nerve back at the table, and whatever I stumbled into is bigger than just a petty family argument. I force a casual shrug, trying not to let him see the way my mind is already racing, already connecting dots that I didn't even know existed. Nothing really, I say, my voice carefully neutral. Just the usual passive-aggressive nonsense. Richard hums, nodding slightly, but there's a knowing gleam in his eye that tells me he doesn't quite believe me. Huh, he muses, reaching for the decanter on the desk and pouring himself another drink. Funny, because she's been acting like you know something. I don't respond, because I don't trust myself to say the right thing, but Richard doesn't seem to mind the silence. He just lifts his glass slightly in my direction, like a toast, before saying something that sends a cold shiver down my spine. To the beautiful women in our family, he says, his voice smooth as honey but sharp as glass, past and present. It's a simple statement, innocent enough on its own, but when I glance back at the dining room, at Linda's pale face and the way she's gripping her wine glass like it's the only thing anchoring her to reality, I realize something. Richard isn't just making a toast. He's making a point. And Linda knows exactly what it is. The room is still buzzing with that uneasy tension, the kind that lingers long after something sharp has been thrown into the air, but hasn't quite landed yet. Richard's toast should have been an afterthought, just another meaningless pleasantry, but the way Linda reacted told me everything I needed to know. There was something behind those words, something only the two of them understood. Something that sent a crack straight down the center of her carefully constructed mask. She had always carried herself like a woman in control, always the most put-together person in the room, always the one dictating the pace of conversations, the one deciding who was worth acknowledging and who was not. But now, sitting there with a too-tight smile and a glass of wine that never seemed to leave her hand, she looked like someone desperately trying to hold something together, something fragile, something crumbling right beneath her fingers. I watched the way Richard took his seat again, his movements slow, deliberate, like a man who had just played his hand and was waiting to see how the rest of the table would respond. He wasn't looking at Linda, not directly, not anymore, but there was an ease to him, a kind of quiet amusement, the look of a man who knew exactly what he had done and was enjoying the fallout more than he probably should. Linda, on the other hand, was the opposite. Her face had gone tight, her lips pressed into a thin, colorless line, her fingers curling and uncurling around the stem of her glass like she was trying to squeeze the life out of it. Melissa, sitting beside her, had gone stiff, her shoulders squared, her eyes darting between her parents as though she was waiting for something to explode. I had never paid much attention to her before, never thought much of her beyond the perfect daughter act she had spent her entire life perfecting, but now I saw it. The way her hands were clenched together in her lap, the way she was breathing a little too evenly. Like someone who had trained themselves not to react. For years, I had assumed that Linda's needling, her constant jabs, her effortless ability to make me feel small, had been about me. I had thought she just didn't like me, that I was the family disappointment, the easy target, the one she could pick apart for sport because no one would stop her. But now, sitting there watching the way she barely blinked in Richard's direction, how her entire body was wound tight enough to snap, I realized that it had never really been about me at all. It had been about control. And tonight, for the first time in years, she didn't have it. Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping idly against the rim of his glass, his expression easy, too easy, like a man who had just set something in motion and was enjoying the show. "Speaking of beautiful women," he said, his voice smooth, casual, like he wasn't about to drop a bomb in the middle of the dinner table. "Jessica, you'd like my new assistant. Smart girl, real go-getter, reminds me of you in some ways." I wasn't the one he was talking to. Not really. I watched Linda's reaction, the way her fingers tightened slightly around her glass, how the muscle in her jaw twitched ever so slightly. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, a tiny fracture in the otherwise perfect porcelain of her expression. Melissa exhaled slowly, barely audible, but it was enough to confirm what I was already starting to suspect. This wasn't new. This was a game they had played before, a script they had read 1,000 times over, one that Melissa had long since learned to brace herself for. Linda's voice, when she finally spoke, was perfectly even, perfectly measured, but I could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "Oh," she said, lifting her glass to her lips, taking a long sip, giving herself a second to steady her voice. "I'm sure she's very capable." Richard smiled, something slow and knowing. "Oh, she is," he said, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "Young, ambitious, full of energy, really dedicated to the job." I saw it then, the way Linda's nails dug into the base of her wine glass, the way her grip tightened just enough to make the thin crystal strain under the pressure. I thought about all the years she had spent making me feel like the family joke, all the times she had smirked when she made some casual remark about my weight, my dating life, my job, all the times she had made me feel like I was somehow failing simply by existing. And now, for the first time, I saw what was really behind it. She had never actually cared about me, never actually cared about my life, my choices, my body. What she had cared about was making sure I stayed beneath her, that I stayed small enough, insignificant enough, to never pose a threat. Because the moment I stopped playing along, the moment I finally pushed back, I had taken something from her. Control. Richard exhaled, shaking his head slightly, like he was amused by something, like this was just another one of his little jokes, like he hadn't just twisted a knife into his wife's stomach in front of everyone. "But you know how it is," he continued, tapping his fingers against the table. "Sometimes you just have to move on from old things, make room for something new." The sound of shattering glass cut through the room like a gunshot. Linda sat frozen, her fingers still curled around the broken remains of her wine glass, crimson liquid spilling across the table, seeping into the pristine white tablecloth, spreading outward like a wound. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And in the heavy silence that followed, I realized something with absolute certainty. Whatever was going on between them, whatever had been simmering beneath the surface for years, tonight was the night it was finally going to boil over. The sound of breaking glass still lingers in the air like the sharp sting of a slap, the entire table frozen in the wake of Linda's shattered composure, the red stain of wine spreading across the pristine white tablecloth like a slow-moving wound. No one speaks, no one dares to move, and for the first time in all the years I have known her, Linda doesn't have an immediate response, doesn't have a sharp retort or a well-placed insult ready to fire back. She just sits there, her fingers curled so tightly around the stem of the broken glass that I half expect her to cut herself, her breathing uneven, her face locked in an expression of something dangerously close to panic. Richard, of course, is the picture of calm, swirling the last remnants of bourbon in his glass with the kind of detached amusement that makes my skin crawl, a man who knows exactly how far he can push before things spiral completely out of his control. He doesn't so much as glance at his wife, doesn't acknowledge the mess she has made, doesn't offer her even the smallest lifeline to recover from the blow he just delivered in front of everyone. If anything, he looks pleased with himself, his smirk barely concealed behind the rim of his drink, his posture too casual for a man who has just lit a match and walked away from the explosion. And I watch Linda, really watch her, the way her jaw tightens, the way her fingers twitch slightly like she's trying to hold something back, the way she swallows hard before forcing a smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes. She knows. She knows exactly what Richard is implying, exactly what this entire dinner has been leading up to, exactly why he made that particular comment about moving on from old things and making room for something new. And it's killing her. Dessert is served, but no one is really eating, forks clinking absently against porcelain as the conversation stumbles along in the clumsiest way possible, everyone trying to pretend like they didn't just witness a marital breakdown in real time. My mother is determinately avoiding eye contact with anyone, my father is suddenly very invested in his slice of pumpkin pie, and Melissa just looks exhausted, like a woman who has been through this too many times before. her fingers twitching slightly against the table, her knee bouncing beneath it like she's desperate for an escape. I lean in just enough so only Linda can hear, my voice light, casual, the exact tone she always uses when she wants to cut me down. Funny how life works, I murmur, tilting my head slightly as I reach for my wine glass. Men do love younger women, don't they? The reaction is immediate. Linda stiffens, her breath hitching just slightly, her fingers curling into fists in her lap, her eyes flashing with something dangerous as she finally turns to look at me, really look at me, her face pale, her expression unreadable. And that's when I know she doesn't just suspect. She knows. Across the table, Melissa reaches for my arm, her grip tight, her nails digging in slightly as she shakes her head, her voice low, urgent, barely more than a whisper. "You don't understand," she says, her tone desperate, pleading. "You're playing with fire. But it's already too late." Linda shoves back her chair so hard that it scrapes loudly against the hardwood floor, the sudden movement making everyone flinch, her breath coming too fast, too shallow, her hands shaking slightly as she forces a brittle laugh, the kind that sounds too sharp, too hollow. Too much like someone on the verge of breaking. "Oh, please," she says, voice dripping with condescension, desperate to regain control, desperate to reassert herself. "Don't flatter yourself, Jessica. You've always been so pathetic. So desperate for attention. I almost feel sorry for you." I smile, slow, deliberate, letting the words roll off me like they mean absolutely nothing, like they don't sting the way they're meant to. Because for once, they don't. Because for the first time, Linda isn't the one holding the knife. "You're right," I say, setting my wine glass down with a soft clink, meeting her gaze head-on. "I might not be skinny, but at least my husband doesn't need a backup plan." The silence is deafening. Linda's eyes go wide for just a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to see the moment the words hit her, the moment she fully registers what I just said, the moment the last of her carefully constructed composure crumbles. She opens her mouth, then closes it again, then opens it once more, like she's grasping for something, anything, that could possibly undo the damage, but there's nothing. Nothing she can say, nothing she can do, nothing that will erase what has just been laid out for everyone to see. Across the table, Richard chuckles softly, shaking his head as he taps the side of his glass with one finger, the faint clinking sound cutting through the silence like a knife. "Well," he says, his voice smooth, unbothered, perfectly composed. "I have an announcement." Linda freezes. And just like that, the entire room holds its breath. Richard taps the side of his glass again, the rhythmic sound slicing through the tense silence like a blade, each soft clink dragging every eye in the room toward him. Every breath in the space collectively held as if the entire table already knows that whatever he is about to say will change the course of the evening forever. He leans back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as if savoring the moment, as if allowing the anticipation to stretch just long enough to make Linda squirm, just long enough to let the weight of inevitability settle over her shoulders before he finally speaks. First of all, he begins, swirling the last of his bourbon in his glass, his voice as smooth and casual as ever, like he's merely making polite conversation, like he isn't about to detonate a bomb in the middle of the dining room. "I just want to say what a wonderful meal this has been. Truly, one for the books." No one says anything. No one moves. The only sound in the room is the distant ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, each second dragging out like an eternity, the weight of the moment pressing heavier and heavier against Linda's shoulders as she grips the edge of the table. Her knuckles white, her breathing uneven, her entire body wound tight as a coil. Richard smiles, that same easy, almost amused expression still playing at the corners of his lips, and then he lifts his glass slightly, as if making another toast. "Linda," he continues, tilting his head slightly in her direction, his voice warm, almost affectionate, the way someone might speak to an old friend, "I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for 25 interesting years." The gasp that ripples through the room is immediate, sharp, cutting through the heavy silence like a blade, the sound of silverware clattering against plates, of someone sharply inhaling, of chairs creaking slightly as people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Linda doesn't move. She doesn't breathe. She just sits there, frozen, her fingers clenched so tightly around the napkin in her lap that I half expect it to tear, her lips slightly parted like she wants to say something, like she wants to stop this before it fully unravels, but the words won't come. Because deep down, she already knows where this is going. Richard exhales, setting his glass down with a soft clink, then folds his hands neatly in front of him, his expression one of practiced ease, of careful detachment, of a man who has already made his decision and is merely going through the motions of delivering the inevitable. But he continues, his voice light, almost too casual. I think it's time we both admit that this has run its course, don't you? Linda's throat bobs as she swallows, her eyes darting toward Melissa, who looks absolutely stricken, her face drained of color, her hands trembling slightly as she grips the edge of the table. Her gaze flicking between her parents like she's waiting for one of them to say something, to stop this, to take it back. Richard sighs, shaking his head slightly, as if mildly disappointed that this conversation is even necessary, as if this should have been obvious to everyone all along. I won't drag this out, he says, leaning forward slightly, his voice softer now, almost sympathetic. I've already spoken with my lawyer. The papers are ready. I wanted to wait until after the holidays, but after tonight, well, it just didn't seem worth the effort. The sound of Linda's breath hitching is barely audible, but I hear it, I feel it, the sharp intake of air, the way her entire body flinches, the way her face goes so still, so eerily blank, that for a moment, I wonder if she's even still processing what's happening, or if she's already gone somewhere else entirely. Richard pushes back from the table, rising to his feet, dusting non-existent lint from the front of his perfectly pressed suit, and then he looks at Linda one last time, his expression unreadable, his voice calm. I'll have my things sent for next week, he says simply, as if discussing a minor inconvenience, as if the last 25 years of marriage have been nothing more than an arrangement that has simply run its course. And then, just like that, he walks away. Melissa is the first to break. She shoves her chair back so hard that it nearly topples over, her face contorted with something between shock and fury, her breathing sharp, uneven, her voice breaking when she finally finds it. Are you kidding me? She snaps, her hands shaking as she turns to her mother, her eyes blazing with accusation. You knew, didn't you? You knew this was coming, and you just sat there. Linda doesn't respond. She doesn't move. She just stares straight ahead, her fingers still clenched around the ruined napkin in her lap, her face so pale that for a moment, I wonder if she might actually pass out. Melissa makes a strangled sound, something between a sob and a bitter laugh, and then she turns on her heel and storms out of the room, leaving only the echo of her footsteps ringing in the heavy silence. And then, finally, Linda snaps. Her chair scrapes against the floor as she suddenly surges to her feet, her eyes wild, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts, her entire body trembling as she turns to me, her voice raw, furious, desperate. You, she hisses, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. This is your fault. You think this is funny? You think you won? I tilt my head, watching her, waiting, letting her unravel just a little bit more before I finally let my lips curl into a slow, deliberate smile. Oh, Linda, I say softly, leaning back in my chair, lifting my glass in a lazy toast. I'd say you'd be prettier if you lost a few pounds, but, well, weight's not really your biggest problem right now, is it? The look on her face is worth every single insult, every single year of passive-aggressive cruelty, every single dig and jab and sneer she ever threw my way. She staggers slightly, her breath shallow, her hands shaking, her entire world collapsing around her, and for the first time in my life, I see her exactly as she is. Small, powerless, alone. I take a slow sip of my wine, savoring the taste, the victory, the delicious satisfaction of watching Linda finally crumble. And then I smile, the warmth of the moment sinking into my bones as I meet her gaze one last time. Happy Thanksgiving, Linda.